So I've been promising for a while that I was going to make a video in which I talked about Chris Lipe and his particular wrongdoing in the story of how I have been abused by the Scrabble community and banned from playing, and beyond that, just in the overall ostracism and bullying of me. So that's what this video is going to be about. And I want to let you know that in addition to this video, I am making a new post available on splenetic.net, which is not really a new post. I'm publishing it today for the first time, but it is something that I wrote back in August of 2021. And this is actually more than a half year before the Clinchys and Lola began this campaign to get me driven out of Scrabble. It was something that I originally wrote just for my own therapeutic purposes, to talk about the abuse that I had endured. And I think one thing that comes across in it is that the greatest wrongdoer and the person who I actually had the biggest axe to grind with was Chris Lipe. Now, I will warn you that this is a very long, unedited post that has a lot more raw emotion in it and is much less clean and well-written in a final product than most of the other things on the blog. And that is very much intentional, because I was writing it just for myself in the beginning, and if I had intended to make it public, I would have definitely spent some time editing it down, taking out that redundancy, taking out some of that emotion. But at this point in my life, given the trauma that I've been through and the increased wrongdoing that both Chris Lipe and the Clinchys have piled on, I no longer care about taking the mental time and energy to edit it down. I'm just going to share it with you exactly as my emotions were at that time in 2021 and how that first draft of that whole thing came across. But keep in mind, it is a document from about 4 years ago, so it's not illustrative of how I am feeling right now about all this stuff. It's illustrative of how I was feeling back then. But also, it's a hard read because it is so long and unedited and unpolished in a lot of ways. I don't expect everyone to sit and read through the whole thing. And at the same time, I think it is an important piece of historical evidence of where things were actually at and what I'd already perceived to be true in this story at that time 4 years ago. And that's why I wanted to put it out in its complete, unedited form. But part of what I want to do in this video is also just give you some of the highlights of it in reference to Chris Lipe's behavior, some of the key points that are in there. But also, I want to talk about some of the wrongdoing that Chris has done after this time, because keep in mind that most of Chris's wrongdoing in this campaign to get me banned actually happened after this time of August 2021 when I first wrote this document. So let me just talk about a few of the main points, and I also want to point out that because I didn't publish this in full and really get it fully ready for publication, I didn't put screenshots of a lot of the conversations in there, but I do actually quote in that document a number of private conversations, both by email and Facebook Messenger, that Chris Lipe and I had. And I do actually have screenshots of all of those things. I'm not going to take the time to edit it and put it out there, but if any of this stuff ever becomes a matter of a legal record, I actually do have the screenshots to back up everything that is said in there. But I want to be clear that Chris has been really very complicit with the Clinchys for a long time in this whole story, and has been trying to prop up their organization. And there's certain things which I mentioned in passing in the document, but I don't really go into a whole lot of detail about it. One of my motivations in publishing the first two posts of the blog, what was called the Crucible and the Fallout, was that I believed Chris, who was already president of WESPA by this time, actually had in motion plans to try to get some sort of international recognition by WESPA of CoCo, of getting some of their tournaments rated by CoCo, by WESPA, before I ever published this blog, when they were just starting to get launched as an organization. And what ended up happening was a lot of the sort of PR damage that I did to their brand as a result of putting out those first two blog posts, I think actually slowed down that process, and they didn't end up getting in coordination with WESPA at all at that time. But I believe it actually did start happening a couple of years later, once they began the overt political campaign to get me banned in 2022. Because it wasn't that long after that campaign began before I even started being able to get my documents into NASPA and other Scrabble organizations defending myself, that WESPA began rating WGPO and CoCo tournaments, which were sometimes the same tournaments, because there were a number of tournaments that WGPO and CoCo were co-organizing. So I think this is a really important point here, is that Chris, as the president of NASPA, was actually as the president of WESPA, was arguably the most important person in actually helping CoCo and WIGPO get international recognition, get their tournaments rated internationally. And I have no doubt that he did this because he was very unhappy with John Chu's leadership in NASPA. And there's a long story there. Chris had previously been on some executive committees with NASPA and had been very frustrated about working with NASPA and had checked out of it. And he and I had still been friends for a lot of that time and openly talked about it with each other in private conversations. So I knew that Chris was very fed up with John Chu as a leader of NASPA. And he wasn't the only one. That's part of the reason that WIGPO and CoCo got formed in the first place, because so many people were fed up with John Chu's leadership. And there's a lot that I agree with Chris about how bad a job John Chu has been a leader, and that we need new governance in North American tournament Scrabble. But at the same time, as I tried to make clear in my video about the drunk history of Scrabble, I believe that starting new renegade associations which get parallel recognition alongside NASPA is not the proper way to do it. And it's especially not the proper way to do it if those organizations do not actually have Scrabble in the name. So I am advocating in that Drunk History of Scrabble video what I think is a much better path to reforming North American Scrabble rather than the creation of a bunch of these renegade organizations. And you can look back at that video for more details on that in particular. But I want to be clear that I feel like there was a lot of political importance for me in speaking up on this blog in the first place. And even though I framed it as a personal story, it very much was the case that when I published those first two posts, the Crucible and the Fallout, there was political intention in holding the leaders of CoCo accountable for their actions and making sure they didn't get too much political power. And I thought that at the time, the best way to do that and to get them back to sanity was to actually make this a very personal story, just telling personally about how this bad blood had developed rather than delving into all the Scrabble politics. I have since that time really changed my tack and gotten more directly into speaking about the Scrabble politics, but there's a lot in this particular article, The Ostracism, where I kind of spell out some of the political intention and feelings behind all of that. So it does give you more detail on that, but it also gives you more detail on ways in which Chris Lipe and a few of the other friends of the Clinchys, especially Jeremy Conman, acted as massive bullies after I put out those first two posts in 2020. And they actually berated other people, in particular one player named Kenny Mizui, to try to take down posts that actually mentioned and had links to my blog because they were so obsessed with creating a cover story and hiding my blog post from actually being read by a lot of the Scrabble community because they knew that I proved the wrongdoing of the Clinchys and that it was going to damage their brand. And Chris showed very clearly throughout this, both in his posts and social media and in his private conversations with me, a complete moral relativism in which he didn't care about the truth and just cared about painting things in a particular way to make the Clinchys look like the good guys and me look like the bad guy. And I spell out a lot of ways in this particular post in which Chris was being very disingenuous, very dishonest, and very insulting to me. So all of that is spelled out in there. I'm not going to go too much into detail there. If you really want more of the details of what those interactions with me and Chris were and those private conversations, go into that post to see it. But I do want to make clear that the post that Kenny made was in reference to a friend of his who committed suicide in his early 20s. And he was a Scrabble player who had complained about a lot of bullying in the Scrabble community. And I think there's zero doubt in a lot of people's minds in Scrabble that that bullying in the Scrabble community is partially what led to this young man's suicide. Now, I want to tell you, I met this young man once. I had very little interaction with him. I barely know anything about his life. I do not know who specifically bullied him and what the story is there. And I'm not making any accusations that either Chris or the Clinchys were directly involved in that bullying. I don't know if they were or not. But I want to be clear that Chris and the Clinchys were very much part of, kind of the leaders of this sort of sub-segment of the Scrabble community that was very bullying, that was very picking on and mean to a lot of other people. And one of the things that testifies to that, it's actually in some of the documents I included in my initial response to NASPA, is a letter that Brian Bowman gave me over email, where he talked about a particular group I think it was like a Facebook conversation group that included Evans Clinchys, included Chris Lipe, included Jason Broersma, that was extremely bullying in nature, and that Brian Bowman was temporarily a part of, but ended up quitting or getting thrown out of and not coming back to. But that Brian witnessed a lot of this bullying kind of behavior firsthand. And I want to be clear here, while I'm saying, like, I don't know if this directly connects to the Avery story, I do think there are a lot of ways in which these guys built this kind of bullying culture and might have encouraged other people to bully in ways that might have actually directly hurt Avery and directly contributed to his suicide. And I do think there is a certain aspect to which, after Avery's suicide, Evans quite possibly was shaken up about this and was actually obsessed with trying to paint a more positive image of himself and come across as less of a bully than he had before. Not necessarily because he was directly liable for what happened to Avery, but because of perhaps feelings of guilt of the ways in which he had been a bully in the community. But to me, one of the really disgusting things about this story is that I know that Evans was trying to repair his image, but I think it's also the case that all of these guys became more bullying when I started putting things out there, showing the truth of their actions, trying to hold them accountable for their bullying. And the things that made them the most bullying was they had to bully people into silence because they couldn't have that story exposed. And quite simply, there was absolutely nothing wrong with the post that Kenny made on this NASPA member concerns list. It was only really talking about him and Avery and the bad things that happened to Avery and his concern about that. He didn't actually talk about my story at all. He just gave a link to my blog and mentioned in passing that it was another story about bullying in the Scrabble community, and that there were similar strands he saw in that story in terms of what happened to me as what happened to Avery. So he wasn't commenting on my particular story, he was just saying he felt something similar in reading it than what he already felt in the Avery story. But this got Chris Lipe and Jeremy Conman so mad, they temporarily deleted this post, forced him to put it back up without the link to my blog, and then Chris continued to berate Kenny in the comments of this post, trying to intimidate him into taking down the post. This is not fitting behavior for a president of WESPA in so many ways. For one thing, it was a NASPA group that the president of WESPA should not have been involved in, should not have been a moderator for. There was a conflict of interest there. Secondly, what Chris was doing was trying to squelch free speech that was entirely appropriate to NASPA member concerns, that was directly about bullying in the community, a very topical subject, and Kenny's message was not saying anything offensive. And maybe you take a different take from my original posts than Kenny did, but even if you did, Kenny didn't say anything that would offend you, right? Kenny didn't say anything about Evans or Jennifer or about me and take any sides in that argument. He simply said that this story was something that evoked particular emotions for him. But just giving attention to that story is something that was completely unacceptable for Chris Lipe and brought out his inner bully. So that's one thing I think that Chris did that is completely unfitting of a Scrabble leader. And that's one thing that he unquestionably did, that there is evidence out there that he did. I want to tell you, though, that there are a few other things that Chris did much later, or that I believe Chris did, that I don't fully have all of the evidence to prove. And one of them is the whole thing with Michael Tang making a new rule to ban me from the Alchemist Cup based on the bans from WESPA and CoCo. Quite simply, WESPA and CoCo were very local organizations that only mattered to people in the U.S., and even then only in like specific regions of the U.S., and didn't have any international recognition. They weren't a WESPA recognized association. They didn't have tournaments that were rated internationally. And there's zero reason to think that any international director, particularly one as far away as Malaysia and Singapore, would have even known about them or given them the time of day in terms of making any policy decisions. And you look at the story and say, who realistically could have talked to Michael Tang and given him the idea to actually take these decisions about me that were made by both WESPA and CoCo, that were totally kangaroo court decisions, by the way. I hadn't even given a defense yet before they were jumping to conclusions of trying to punish me based on the words of others. But to make that an official policy that would actually affect something like a World Cup of Scrabble, which is what the Alchemist Cup essentially was, Quite simply, realistically, there's no person other than Chris Lipe who could have talked to Michael Tang about this. I'm almost 100% sure that it was Chris Lipe who talked to Michael Tang about this. And I'm happy to be proven wrong if Chris or Michael wants to provide evidence to the contrary. But until I get evidence to the contrary, I'm going to assume that Chris is the one who actually talked to Michael Tang about this. And that, quite simply, by itself, Chris, if I had competent legal representation that had been able to subpoena people properly, that had been able to turn over those documents from whatever communication there was between you and Michael Tang and show that you actually had a hand in getting this policy change to keep me out of the Alchemist Cup, even if NASPA had not done any bullying to me, even if NASPA had said I was guilty of nothing and that I had no punishments whatsoever, Michael Tang's rule still would have banned me from the Alchemist Cup, and you quite possibly would have been guilty of conspiracy to defame. Quite simply, what you did probably broke the law in terms of damaging my life and reputation. Again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not 100% sure of this, but that is how disgusting and immoral you are, Chris. That you're literally just not caring about reality, not caring about the law, not caring about doing things in any fucking ethical way whatsoever. You're willing to cross any line in order to make me the bad guy and cover up the immoral actions of your friends, including escalating to a tournament on the other side of the world. That is what a disgusting, immoral shitbag you are, Chris Lipe. And that right there is reason alone that you need to be off of the WESPA board. But I also want to be clear, that's not the only thing you've done that's disgusting like that. All right? Look, I know from the leaks I got in the WESPA communication that I had when I tried to appeal my NASPA decision to the WESPA board, that you had already sent an email, not an email, well maybe it was an email, it was in the email list, that had the full contents of that short email you would send me later, telling me that you could not, handle my appeal until after NASPA had handled my appeal themselves. By the way, there was a typo in that, a triple T in a word, that was in both what you posted in the original list and then in the thing you cut and paste into the email to me. That's what a sloppy job you did. You didn't even notice this typo and copied it to multiple places. But anyway, point being is that I'm pretty damn sure you intentionally put that email into that WESPA email list as a way of creating false evidence that you were doing the right thing and actually trying to contact me and tell me what you needed to tell me in terms of being unable to handle my appeal. Quite simply, there's no plausible reason it took about a week for me to get that email. The story that I heard, that I did talk about in the blog already, is that the secretary, Carol Johnson, who'd already been ghosting me for a long time. I'd been told that she was my official contact person, but she was not emailing me at all, giving me zero contact whatsoever, even when other people on the board were telling me she was my official contact person. I'm pretty close to 100% sure you said something to her by some sort of back channel. Whether it was a voice call, whether it was a messenger thing or a text message or some other thing, outside of that mailing list, you told Carol, do not send that email to Dave. Why? Because you're a petty asshole who hates me and wanted to slow down this process so there was no way I could get into the World Scrabble Championship in time in 2023. So again, if subpoenas had managed to turn over any of this back channel communication between you and Carol showing that you very intentionally created bureaucratic delay to stop this stuff from getting emailed to me, then it could have got you in more legal trouble, man. You really were just fucking doing terrible things, possibly illegal things, to just obstruct me, to interfere with my life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, to damage my reputation. And all of this is gross. Now, again, this is my supposition. This is my guesswork. There's a little bit of intuition going on here. But again, I'm going to assume that I'm right and that you did talk to Carol in some way behind the scenes and get her not to send that email until I have evidence that shows otherwise. Because really, it seems like it's a really, really, really strong possibility based on the ridiculously unethical behavior that you had in those WESPA meetings, in those WESPA email conversations, of which, as I said, a fair amount was leaked back to me by other people on that board. So, all in all, Chris, I want you to know that, as I told you before, I'm not really all that angry as I was when I wrote that post and I was earlier on. If anything, the fact that the Clinchys and Lola came out with their accusations actually helped me be a lot less angry at you because I now had a way forward. There was so much time before that where they were being assholes to me behind the scenes, and you were keeping it behind the scenes, where if I ever spoke up, I would look like the aggressor. And what actually kind of made me happy about them going on this all-out attack on me to destroy my reputation and to get me officially banned from the Scrabble associations is that it now gives me moral license to speak up about all of this without looking like the aggressive asshole. I am not. I am only defending myself. I am only being bitter and nasty because you all are still obstructing me from playing Scrabble. And quite simply, the only thing you need to do to stop getting abused by me, to stop getting called out for being the immoral assholes that you are, is to get out of my fucking way and let me play this game. I will put a link to the post, The Ostracism, in the comments. I hope you enjoyed listening, and if you want to read that, I really thank you. Again, it is tough reading, but I also think it sheds a lot of light on the relationship between me and Chris and a lot of his wrongdoing and ways that he has been involved in this story, even though he hasn't been a really essential part that I've written in a lot of the other posts.